Hey everyone, welcome back to Master Your Marriage. Last week, we introduced the concept of the window of tolerance. This is an idea that we have this optimal state where we can think clearly, we can communicate clearly and effectively, and we can stay emotionally connected even when having difficult conversations. But when we get pushed outside of that window, we either escalate into hyperarousal, or we get loud and anxious and reactive, or we shut down into hypoarousal, where we withdraw, go silent, or maybe even feel totally numb.
And understanding this has been such a game changer for us in our marriage and also for many of the couples that we work with. But knowing about the window of tolerance is really just the first step, right? The real magic doesn't happen until you can recognize in real time when you or your partner are outside your window and then respond in a way that actually helps rather than make things worse.
Such a hard thing to do, to respond in real time, right? To recognize that in real time. Okay, so today we're going to make this whole thing super practical. We want to give you some tools. We're going to help you identify the warning signs that you or maybe your partner are getting dysregulated. And we'll walk you through a couple of real life examples, including something that happened to us just this week.
Just a couple of days ago.
When my own window of tolerance sort of shrunk down just a little bit because of something that happened, and we're going to get to sharing that.
We'll also give you some specific tools for how to respond, whether you or your partner tend to go hyper, right? Which is, as Robert said, getting louder, overwhelmed, defensive, or whether you tend to go hypo arousal, again, shutting down, zoning out, or feeling disconnected.
I like to say it's either getting big or getting small.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the way you handle each of these states needs to be a little bit different, right? There's a little bit different strategy for the hyper versus the hypo.
Yeah.
And we're going to show you exactly what to do today. So, time for stories.
Oh yeah. And you know what? I'm grateful that I could provide an entire example for today's episode.
Well, most of the things we share on this podcast are exactly that, right? They're either real life experiences that we're going through, or maybe a message that, is from maybe a particular client that we're working with. We certainly have enough content to make an episode every week just from our own life.
Without a doubt.
So last weekend, I guess it was, Robert took a trip to Virginia to visit our oldest son. And his wife. And, I think we've mentioned on the podcast before, they just bought their first home, and they're also about halfway through their pregnancy, their first baby, which means they've got about 1 million projects that they want to get finished. And if you know Robert, he doesn't just visit.
Oh, no.
No, he shows up with a tool belt on, ready to work. So let's go
fix things.
They spent the whole weekend together building a fence, fixing up the yard, swapping out locks, talking about future renovations. I mean, you name it, you guys tackled it, right?
Yeah, without a doubt, right?
So here's where things take a turn.
Oh, yeah. Not one of my finer moments. Let's just put it that way.
It's Robert's last day, and he's walking down their stairs from their upstairs to their main floor, which it's a hardwood staircase, and he was wearing socks.
Oh, yeah. There's been better choices made.
Right. And so he's carrying also, by the way, as he's walking down the stairs, he's carrying tools in both hands, and suddenly he slips. You almost made it, right?
Well, I mean, I was also trying to be quiet because I thought maybe they were still asleep. And so I got to the very last step, and I was looking out on the deck to see if maybe one of them was out there having breakfast or something. And
suddenly he slips.
Both my feet just went out.
Full send, right?
Full
feet
send.
In the air, lands flat on his back on the wooden staircase.
Yep. I racked my elbow on one piece, even knocked off a little tread. It was good.
Tore the blinds down when you went full send.
Tools were in the air, come clattering down. It was super sneaky and quiet. Yep.
Right. So for the past 3 days, he's been actually in quite a lot of pain. That hurt a lot. He's bruised.
That was a little rough. Yeah.
And I knew he was hurting, but here's the thing. He really hadn't been talking about it much after he got home from Virginia. So, he wasn't complaining. And so for me, I knew it had happened, but I wasn't there when it happened. And so it kind of faded into the background. And so anyway, fast forward to last night, and Robert's working in the basement on another project.
Was it last night or the night before?
Okay. Yes. Right. It was the night before. So he's in the basement working on another project. He's building furniture again, because you know him. If you know him, that's his happy place, working on projects, except this time it wasn't a happy place.
Happy, not so happy place. Yeah, it wasn't going well.
The project wasn't coming together the way he wanted it to. And I could hear his frustration from upstairs in the kitchen. So at one point I walked down to ask him a really simple question, nothing major, just a quick thing. And he snapped at me.
You were so kind. She had brought me some food, and I'm in the middle of this thing that is like quite literally falling apart in front of my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm embarrassed a little bit because it's not going the way I want it to go. And then 2, I'd only allotted maybe 35 minutes for this. And I'm about 2 hours into bending over, leaning, and a lot of pushing and pulling, which is not, of course, not making my back feel any better at that point in time.
So he snaps at me in this kind of sharp, irritated, response. And immediately I
tried a lame apology, but I don't think it worked.
I don't remember an apology, actually.
I said, I'm sorry, I'm really stressed right now or something like
anyway,
that.
Anyway, I could feel myself getting a little bit defensive, right? But I didn't think right then in the moment about the window of tolerance, in all honesty. I knew that all I really was shocked by was that my typically pretty patient husband had just snapped at me, and I didn't like that. And if you've ever been in that situation, you know how contagious reactivity can be, right? Yep. Someone snaps at you. What do you want to do? You feel like immediately snapping back, especially if you go hyper arousal like I do. And so instead of snapping back, I paused and I just kind of excused myself, and I went upstairs to the kitchen and I started giving him some space by doing dishes, right? And later that night, I could still feel that I was a little irritated with him. He came up from downstairs and I'm like, I just want to go to bed. I don't even want to talk to him right now. And I could feel that, okay, now I'm starting to notice, okay, my window of tolerance is narrower than usual. Even though nothing really had happened, I could just feel off. And then Robert gets into bed, he rolls over and he winces. And that's when it hit me. I was like, oh, that's right. I had completely forgotten how much pain he was in. He hadn't mentioned it in a while, but of course that pain was still there. And the pain, of course, all pain, whether it's physical pain, emotional pain, it shrinks our capacity to cope because it shrinks our window of tolerance.
Absolutely.
It makes us more irritable, more reactive, and more likely to be on those edges of the window and slip out.
We talked a little bit about that last week.
We did.
Yeah.
So that's when I realized, hey, this really wasn't about me. It wasn't about his project or the question that I asked him. It was his nervous system, and it was taxed, and his window of tolerance had shrunk because his body was hurting. And I almost reacted in a way that would have escalated the situation and made it worse rather than helping us to reconnect.
Yeah. And I wasn't thinking about my window of tolerance. The project was irritating me, right? I was hurting, but I didn't realize in the moment how narrow that had sort of made my window of tolerance. I didn't know how it was affecting me.
Yeah.
But that's true for everyone, right?
This is exactly why today's episode is so important, because we often don't recognize what's really happening in real time. We end up reacting in ways that ultimately pull us farther apart.
Yeah.
But when we can pause and piece it together, when we understand why we're feeling off or why our partner is feeling off, and recognizing that we're outside of our window, it gives us more power really to be able to handle those moments differently. And, I wouldn't say we handled it poorly, because we just gave some space and eventually figured it out an hour later.
We didn't snap back and forth.
No.
That's not what happened. So before we get into the tools, let's take a quick step back and revisit what's actually happening in the nervous system when we're inside or maybe outside of our window of tolerance. So when we're inside our window of tolerance, it's sort of this sweet spot, right? We feel calm, we feel present, we feel able to think clearly, we can handle stress, probably can handle pain. We can process our emotions without being overwhelmed. And most importantly, for relationships, we can stay connected to the people that we love. Even when something challenging is happening, we can respond instead of react.
But when we leave our window, then we go into one of two states. Like we talked about last week, it's either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. And hyperarousal is when everything feels too much. Yeah. It's that anxious, panicked, maybe overwhelmed feeling. You might feel restless or irritated or aggressive. There's a lot of energy, right, in hyperarousal. And this is where those emotional outbursts happen, where the snapping and the lashing out happens.
Right. And then there's hypoarousal, which is the opposite. Instead of being overwhelmed, going big, you go small, you shut down, you sort of feel numb. maybe disconnected, zoned out, right? Sometimes you're even disassociated, like you're not really there. So instead of too much energy, there was almost no energy.
Exactly. And here's what's really interesting. Both of these states happen when the nervous system senses danger.
Right.
But why do people have such opposite reactions?
Yeah. Well, so it really comes down to the autonomic nervous system. Sometimes we call it the ANS, right? And so this is the command and control center that senses danger, and it runs in the background all the time, and it controls a lot of things: heart rate, breathing, digestion. But it has two branches, right? So the first branch is the sympathetic nervous system, which spins you up, and then the parasympathetic system, parasympathetic, right, which calms you down. When we're inside our window of tolerance, these two systems are balanced. The brain is working smoothly. Our prefrontal cortex, the problem solver, logic center, right, is in charge. And our amygdala, which is the part that senses danger, is not sending out overt signals to either one of those two systems.
Yeah, it's not on overdrive or overreacting.
Yeah. And so when we talk about this hypo versus hyper arousal, right, we have fight, flee, right?
Fight.
Or freeze. And freeze, right? Freeze tends to be that other one.
So when we're in hyper arousal, ramped up, revved up, would you call it spun up?
Spun up.
Then the sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive. So the brain floods the body with stress hormones. The amygdala takes over now instead of the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala takes over, and suddenly, like Robert just said, fight or flight mode. And that's why it feels so intense, because your brain is literally telling your body to fight back or to run.
Yeah.
And then there's the hypo.
And in hypoarousal, the opposite happens. Instead of being ramped up, the parasympathetic nervous system allows everything to slow way down, right? Brain activity in areas responsible for alertness and emotional regulation all decrease. And it can feel like sort of shutting you down. It's like your brain sort of hits the off switch to protect you.
And this is where I think we really need to have compassion for ourselves and also for our partners, because those reactions that we just talked about, they're not something that people are really choosing.
No.
That's hard, I think, to accept, that we're not really choosing those responses. When we snap or we withdraw, when we react in ways that we end up regretting later, it's not because we're bad partners. It's because our nervous system has been pretty much hijacked, right?
Yeah. Well, and the amygdala is not known for logic centers or pre-planning, right? Like the prefrontal cortex is, right? So this is almost exactly what happened to me this week, right? My window of tolerance was already smaller than usual because of, my back was sore, which meant I sort of got pushed into this hyper arousal a little faster than I normally would. Maybe we call that a short fuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
But my window of tolerance was, and then it wasn't just short tempered. I was just really already maxed out. So we add pain, add frustration, everything else. And it didn't take much to take me outside of that window of tolerance.
Perfect.
Not much.
And that's why this really matters. When we can recognize what's happening, not just in ourselves, but in our spouse, then we can handle those moments so much better. So let's talk about exactly what to do when you or your partner get dysregulated. So we've talked about what happens when we leave our window of tolerance, but what if we could catch it right before we're fully dysregulated? What if we could recognize those early warning signs before we either snap or shut down or do something that we end up regretting?
Right. And these are the tools we want to talk about, right? So the truth is, dysregulation usually doesn't happen all at once, right? It feels like it just happened in the moment, but there really are actual signs, some little clues, little early signs that tell us before we're starting to slip, or maybe as that window starts to close. The key is to learn how to notice those clues before we hit that point where we've just fallen outside of our window of tolerance.
So for people who tend to go hyper arousal, like I tend to most of the time, some of the first signs might be physical. Like you might feel your heart starting to beat a little bit faster. You might feel your breathing gets shallower. You might feel your muscles tense up. For me, my TMJ, like I can feel my jaw starting to tense up. Mentally, you might notice your thoughts speed up, or that you're starting to feel irritable or just agitated, even though nothing really has even happened yet. Nothing major has even happened. There's these early warning signs.
Yeah. Yeah. And for people who lean towards this hypoarousal, the signs might be different. Instead of feeling amped up, you actually might start feeling fatigued or disconnected. you might start to feel like you're moving a little slower, or you're zoning out. You're struggling to focus. Like people are talking to you and you're just like, oh, I don't know. Right. And you've seen that. We've seen that in people who get stressed. They're just like, now their lack of focus, they don't really even know. Sometimes time will pass without them paying attention to it.
Yeah. Right. Time, like slipping away and not really being able to pay attention to time.
Yeah.
So the best way to catch these signs is to do a little self-study, because dysregulation can look a little bit different for everyone. So the more you can pay attention, the easier it really gets for you to be able to spot some of your own patterns.
So one of the ways you can do this is just a daily self-check-in. Just come inside a little bit, right? Inside of yourself, and just do a quick scan, right? Just say, like, how am I feeling? How are my emotions? And ask yourself a couple of questions, like, what's happening in my body? Do I feel a little tense and irritable today? What's happening in my mind? Are my thoughts racing? Or are they foggy and I'm a little bit slow today? Right? How are my emotions as I check in? Am I anxious? Am I irritated? Am I numb? How's my energy feel? Right? Do I feel like I'm like full of energy? Do I feel like maybe I have too much energy? Like I want to go out and just, get everything? Or do I feel like maybe I'm slowing down?
Yeah. And so we actually break this down, and we have a new handout that I'm going to release with this episode. I'll put the link to it in the show notes to kind of guide you through this self-evaluation process that Robert just described.
Absolutely.
And once you start recognizing your patterns, then you'll probably notice that you have some specific tells, these little signals that you're starting to slip out of your window. And for me, I know another one of mine is when I'm moving into hyperarousal, I start to feel a little bit superior. I start to think about how I'm better, or look down my nose a little bit at other people. And so the moment I catch myself thinking, like, why can't everyone just do things my way or see things my way? That little thought that comes to my mind, that's a tell. And I know, okay, Charla, whoa, back up and bring myself back down, like literally bring myself down, both into the window, but also from that one up position that I'm moving toward.
Yeah. And that's huge. To catch yourself early is way easier than having to repair something when you've sort of spoken out of turn or out of frustration. I used to have this saying, and it was before even we learned some of these tools. If everyone around me is a complete butthead, it's not everybody around me. It's me. And then, then I used to say, okay, now I have to adjust my thinking and realize that I'm the one that's really shallow, and really my window of tolerance is super small. I can get pushed out on either side. So what can I then do about that? Right. And so if you do feel like self slipping, just sort of that recognition, right? For me, it's when everybody's an idiot. If I walk around and everybody is completely an idiot, I already know that there's something going on. So I want to check in. Like, am I just tired? Right? Am I injured, or any of those types of things? And so if you think about what set me up, so let's talk about what set me up for this last one, right? So I had a long flight back from East Coast.
No sleep.
So, relatively lack of sleep, because I had we went East Coast to West Coast. So lack of sleep, I'm injured. I went right back to work, and then I'm working on a project. So long day, working on a project, just trying to finish it up. And then it starts to go south. Right. Right. And so just about everything perfect that you could do
to close your window,
right? Emotionally fatigued, injured.
Totally.
Yeah. Right. So like all those things. So I had this perfect storm, right?
Exactly. And those aren't, like, I want to make it clear that these aren't excuses.
No.
This is just real life. And neither one of us, nothing bad happened. It was that we both just needed to recognize where we were at and give a little bit of grace and compassion. So what we're asking you guys to consider doing is just to start to pay attention to what your tells are. What do you feel when you start to get dysregulated? What are the first signals for you that you're moving towards hyper or hypo? Because the sooner you can catch it, obviously, the sooner that you can manage it.
Yeah, absolutely. And once we know how to recognize sort of this dysregulation, right? The next step is knowing what to do, especially in a relationship where one person's dysregulation can maybe trigger the other person into dysregulation,
which always
right?
Seems to happen all the time, right?
So we want to get into some of the specific tools we want you to use when either you or your partner are outside of your window of tolerance.
Okay. So now that we know a little bit better how to recognize when we're moving outside that window, let's talk about some things that you can actually do about it.
Yeah.
Because awareness is great, but if we don't have the tools to actually regulate ourselves, then we're going to struggle.
Yeah.
So what are some things we can do?
Well, and here's the unique thing. What works for one person may not work for another. So in a perfect example, Charlotte would want to do breath work and I'd want to take a walk. Those are two separate things, right? And so you just have to figure out what works for you. And there's some specific tools depending on where you go. If you tend to go into hyper arousal where everything feels like too much, you're probably going to need some tools to discharge that extra energy and bring your nervous system back down, right? If you go into hypo arousal where everything feels numb, your tools would be selected to wake you up and bring your system back online.
Exactly. So let's start with hyper and we'll go through a few of these tools. So when you're feeling anxious, overwhelmed, or on that edge, if you tend to go hyper, if that's you, the goal again is to slow down your nervous system and release some of that excess energy. So here's some things you can try, experiment with and see what works. As Robert said, I love breath work. So I love the 4-7-8 pattern. So you inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8, and repeat, do 4 cycles of that.
Right. I would be more the movement guy.
Okay. So talk about that.
Get out, get that energy out, do some push-ups, maybe climb the stairs 5 or 6 times if you can't get outside, lift some weights, ride a bike, or even just shake out your arms and legs. Like, I'm just burning off the energy. That's more me.
We mentioned one of these last week. We mentioned grounding techniques, and that's where you can use your 5 senses to get back into your body too. So instead of being outside of your body, you come back and get more present into the present. So we mentioned this last week, name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, 1 thing that you can taste, right? That's a grounding exercise.
Well, so you could maybe listen to music, something calming or rhythmic that maybe help shift your state. Or if you need to burn off some steam, blast something maybe intense and maybe move with it.
Shake it out.
Shake it out.
Okay. You could try squeezing a stress ball. You could try pressing your hand against a wall to release built up tension. You could try humming. You could try singing. Because again, we've talked about this on past episodes. Humming and singing activate the vagus nerve. And that can help to calm you down.
Yeah. Maybe you just go spend some time outside, fresh air, or even just stepping outside will just sort of clears the air, but it really does help you relax.
Okay. So what about the hypo?
All right. Hypoarousal. This is when you're starting to feel sluggish, zoned out, maybe disconnected. And here, the goal for this one is to wake up your nervous system and bring more energy into your body. Here's a few ideas that may help. So again, also go outside, move your body, go for a short walk. Maybe even rub your hands together, create a little bit of warmth.
Yeah. And maybe it's a different kind of movement. Maybe for the hypo, since you're waking up, it's not like I can see you in hyper and you get on the Peloton and you're like full speed on the Peloton.
Yeah.
But for someone who's hypo, maybe it's just starting by just rubbing my hands together.
Or just and getting up and just go for a little walk or something, right? Yeah.
Right.
Just a little warm up kind of thing.
Hypo could also use some cold exposure.
Cold plunge. Let's go.
Cold plunge, or splash cold water on your face, take a cold shower, or even just in your hands, hold an ice pack for a few seconds to help to wake you up.
Yeah. Music. I had music on the last one too, but let's talk about upbeat music, right? Something with a little bit more beat, some power to kind of get you moving.
Stimulate your body, your mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, we could come back into the senses again. This time though, maybe I grab a textured blanket and I just start by feeling the texture of the blanket. Maybe I open up my olfactory system by smelling something really powerful like essential oils. Maybe I eat something that is crunchy or spicy to sort of anything that brings you into the present moment that's going to wake up your senses.
Yeah, absolutely. Change your posture. Right. So like if you're slouched, sit up, maybe do some stretching.
You can also try any kind of rhythmic movement. So rocking, swaying, right, can help to re-engage your nervous system. Again, we're talking about the hypo. How can we help the hypo to sort of wake up?
Yeah. And the opposite would be for your lighting, right? Like if you're feeling hypo and you sort of chose a dark corner of the room or something like that, open the curtains, add a little more light or walk outside where it's a little bit brighter. This natural sunlight is amazing for our nervous system.
I love that idea. And one more we'll do is for the hypo to talk to someone who you feel is safe. social connection is a really powerful way to be able to come back online when we're shut down. So one of the best tools, no matter whether you're hypo or hyper, is going to be co-regulation. That's when we use another person or pet to help to regulate our nervous system, because remember, we take signals from each other.
Yeah.
So that might mean sitting next to someone who feels safe, your spouse, perhaps, holding hands, or even just syncing your breath with their breath. And this is actually rooted in polyvagal theory. And it's the idea that our nervous system is constantly scanning for cues of danger or safety. Several times a second is like scanning. Am I safe or am I in danger? And what we all need most is to be able to replace those cues of danger with cues of safety.
Yeah.
So when we can co-regulate with someone else, that helps with that.
Yeah. And because when we feel safe, our nervous system naturally starts to sort of regulate itself again. It calms down, or just sort of brings it up to that sort of steady state.
So this brings us right back to the beginning, back to the story of what happened the other night with Robert. So after we got into bed and he winced, remember I said, that's when I went, oh, that's what was going on. That's when I finally put those pieces together. I realized, okay, this isn't about me. This isn't about the project. This is about his body being in pain and all these things that have led up to that, that's this perfect storm, and his window of tolerance is just smaller than usual. So instead of bringing it up and like, hey, you did this thing earlier, I didn't like it. Instead of bringing up my frustration or staying irritated with him, I just reached over and nobody really said anything. We just sort of found our hands, just kind of found each other. And
your hand was cold.
It was cold. Come over here. I want your hand to warm my hand up. Yeah. But we just sort of found hands under the blankets, and we didn't really talk about anything at first. We just sort of laid there side by side, kind of breathing together, holding hands together, and feeling ourselves just settling and returning to our window of tolerance.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really the cool part about co-regulation. We didn't need to have this big conversation, probably because there wasn't a big event.
No, there wasn't a thing to fix, really.
It wasn't this fixing moment. It was just sort of this moment of just safety, probably for both of our nervous systems. And that was enough to bring us both back into, I don't even know what it brought peace, regulation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Peace is a good word.
Yeah. Peace.
So as you go into this week, think about, again, what helps you to regulate? What helps your partner to regulate? Experiment with some of these ideas. How can you use co-regulation like we did, right? Just holding hands and breathing together to help bring each other back when things are tough. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Marriage isn't really about never getting dysregulated. That's the part about just being human. It's this human experience. It's about learning how to find your way back and learning how to find your way back together. Well, I think that's it for this episode. So come on over this week on social media. We'd love to continue this conversation. As you practice these techniques, practice learning about yourself, practice learning how to regulate yourself. I think you're going to find they're really awesome techniques. And we want to hear about it. What's worked, what hasn't worked for you this week.
And so if you would too, consider leaving us a 5-star review today with a comment. It really does help us to be able to get our message out to other couples who need to hear it. And if you do know someone who this could benefit, please share it with them. Be kind to each other this week. Put each other first. Remember, it's the small things done often that create the biggest impact.
Until next time.